Welcome to the Unhurried Living podcast. We're sharing leadership conversations to help you develop unhurried rhythms of rest and work. We're helping you overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 267 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and I'm so glad you've joined me here. I'm hopeful that our time together today will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. My first book, An Unhurried Life, which was published now over 10 years ago, has this as its subtitle: Following Jesus' Rhythms of Work and Rest. Knowing what I know now about our great cultural struggle to rest well, I might have changed that to Following Jesus' Rhythms of Rest and Work. It's not that rest is more important than work. It's that real rest is so neglected these days. And many of us are feeling our need for real rest more today than perhaps we ever have. Getting better sleep, setting aside a day a week not measured by productivity or accomplishment, even guarding some weeks each year to really rest is something most of us still struggle to do. Today, I'll share 7 reasons we don't rest well. They aren't theoretical for me. They are reasons I've struggled with entering into the gift of rest that God has always been offering me. I hope that some of these will ring true to you as well, and just might help you move through some of these resistances, misbeliefs, and challenges to a place of deeper rest of body and soul with God. Now, if you're new to the podcast, welcome. I'm so glad you found us here. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'd love if you'd share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. Now, here are my 7 reasons we don't rest well. These 7 reasons we struggle with rest are not the only ones, but they are familiar ones in my life. Each of them represents a misunderstanding about work and rest, or a misbelief about myself and God, or a challenge that confronts me, creating resistance to real rest. So, the first reason we don't rest well is that we have a distorted image of God. We may discover that our gut image of God is one of a God who is only giving us work. Now, especially when it comes to engaging with the important work of God's kingdom, we might imagine that the only way to be faithful going forward is to work until we drop. There was a saying that leaders I looked up to, and they were fond of making this statement: I'd rather burn out than rust out for God. It sounded quite noble and profoundly virtuous. These days, I now ask myself, are those really the only 2 options available to us? Are my choices to waste my life by rusting out or destroy my life by burning out? Was this the way Jesus lived in his 3.5 years of ministry? Even as we learn to work hard in the gracious guidance and profound empowering of God's grace, we would do well to remember the David Psalm, where we are reminded that the Lord is my shepherd. He's my shepherd, and he's your shepherd. In that psalm, David describes God as a shepherd who makes us lie down in green pastures, who leads us beside quiet waters, and who refreshes our souls. Can you hear God's concern for our souls, for our refreshment, for our rest? Why doesn't this vision of God do more to shape how we understand what being a part of God's work in this world looks like? We would do better to rest well if our image of God was seasoned by this Psalm 23 language. We would rest better if we remembered that Jesus once said to his busy and harried disciples, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." The second reason we don't rest well is that we are overtired. Now, that may sound a little silly to some of you. What else can you do when you're really tired but rest? But I've sometimes found that I am too tired to rest well. Entering into rest actually requires at least a bit of intentionality and effort. When I'm overspent, overwhelmed, and overtired, I don't feel I have energy for even a little bit of that sort of intentional effort. The writer of Hebrews, in speaking about God's rest, urges us to make every effort to enter that rest. Now, that rest in context is a Sabbath rest for the people of God. It is God's own rest into which we are invited. But entering that rest actually does require effort. When I'm exhausted, it seems easier to just escape into a series of YouTube videos or to binge watch a show for hours. To do what would actually refresh us or renew us or restore us takes some time and effort. We might turn off our devices and visit with a friend. We might give ourselves a chance to slow down inside enough to read a good book. We might go outside and watch for the creative care of God around us. Good rest requires effort. So when we're overtired, we can feel like it is just too much for us. Now, related to this, the third reason we don't rest well is that we mistake numbing for resting. The ways we use food or the internet or the television or any number of other substances or experiences to escape our weariness are not the same as resting well. When we're numb, we may not feel tired, but that's not the same as finding rest. In fact, when whatever we do to numb finally wears off, as all numbing behaviors do, we usually feel even more tired. You know, it's never been easier to waste our time on empty activities. We can turn on a program on Netflix or Hulu or any number of other media providers, and the autoplay function will keep us occupied indefinitely. We can open YouTube or Facebook, and again, video autoplay will provide us with clips that their algorithm predicts we'll find intriguing. But in all of this, the question is whether we come out the other end of these mindless moments of escape refreshed, renewed, restored, or re-energized. Those words describe what happens when we actually rest well. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to say more about this third reason that we don't rest well in an episode that will be titled Counterfeits of Real Rest. Now, the fourth reason we don't rest well is that we often have an identity resistance to non-productive time. A lot of us only know how to measure our time in terms of getting things done. They might be work things or household things or personal things, but we feel we must always be in production mode. We just might measure our time against the idea that time is money. With this vision of time, resting is a waste. But time could be defined differently. We could say to ourselves that time is love. We could realize that letting ourselves be loved by God, loving God back, and sharing that love with those around us actually requires a restful soul. So one vision of time is focused on acquisition and accomplishment, while the other is focused on expressing genuine care towards God and others. If I believe still that identity is something I don't yet have, but need to achieve by something I do or something I acquire or someone I impress, then I will find myself needing to keep doing things and chasing goals and impressing more and more people. But if my identity is a generous gift of the Father that I bring into my world to bless others, then I'll discover that right alongside the gift of work God is giving me, there is also the gift of deep rest for my body and my soul. I've said before that if I am what I do, then time set aside to rest well feels like an exercise in emptiness. Now, the fifth reason we don't rest well is the reality that our culture is mostly rest resistant. I've found that our culture in general, but also our work cultures, and often even our faith cultures, can be very driven environments. There is often pressure pushing against us making any kind of time to rest day by day, week by week, and so on. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago in an episode titled Cultivating a Good Rest Ethic, most of us have learned, directly or indirectly, how important work is. But few of us have had teachers or mentors in good rest. One of the reasons we began Unhurried Living was to provide modeling and teaching and training in Jesus' good rhythms of rest and work. If you didn't listen to that episode yet, I encourage you, when you're done with this one, to go back for it. This episode is part of a 4-part series on rest, and it feels to me like one of the most important we've produced here so far. Now, the sixth reason we don't rest well is what I call the problem of not yet. I think of all the different chapters of my life, and I realize that I often assumed that rest was impossible in each one of them for one reason or another. We might say to ourselves things like, I'll rest when I get out of school. I'll rest when I get settled in my job. I'll rest when the kids grow up and leave the house. I'll rest when I retire. I'll rest when is a way of finally saying, I'll rest never. There will always be a reason not to rest. I've come to believe that just as truly as Scripture says that today is the day of salvation, today is also a good day to enter into the rest God is giving us in the present moment, in the present day, in the present week, in the present season. There is always a way to receive God's gift of rest. It's good to remember that rest may look different in each season, but postponing rest is not our best option. Finally, the seventh reason we don't rest well is that we simply don't know how. We may be able to easily think of those from whom we learned how to work hard, but it may be far harder to remember people who were good examples of a deeply restful life. There is often little modeling or mentoring along these lines. Most of us have had few examples and no cultural support for good rest. I had to learn how to work. I was basically resistant to my chores and to other work when I was a kid, but work didn't come naturally. I've also had to learn how to rest, but I don't remember anyone in authority in my childhood or even my young adulthood teaching me how to rest. There is a reason God gave commands and guidance about Sabbath rest. The reason is we need it. So there you are. Just to review, the 7 reasons we don't rest well are: first, our distorted images of God; second, being overtired; third, mistaking numbing for resting; fourth, having an identity resistance to non-productive time; fifth, the rest-resistant nature of our culture; sixth, the problem of not yet; and finally, we often don't know how to rest. I wonder if there are 1 or 2 of those that sound especially familiar. It might be good to set aside a little time in the next day or two to talk with God about them. Ask God how He would like to be shepherding you to places of rest and refreshment in this current season of life. I hope you found something in this episode that spoke to where you find yourself. In the next few episodes, I'll be speaking with authors Eric Peterson, Scott McKnight, and Barbara Peacock. I'll also be continuing to share on the theme of rest in episodes like The Counterfeits of True Rest and The Good Work of Soul Rest. I can't wait to share those episodes with you. Now, if you'd like more help cultivating the unhurried way of life and work we talk about here on the podcast, I'd like to invite you to consider our training process called PACE. It's a certificate in leadership and soul care, and it's the most robust training we offer. We'll help you grow in your spiritual leadership perspectives and practices, whatever your role of leadership might be. You might just find the way to places of deeper rest and refreshment. Now, this is a 21-month process involving in-person retreats and Zoom gatherings with mentored learning and practice between. There has never been a better time to give focused attention to your own spiritual life so that you can help others do the same. To learn more, go to unhurriedliving.com/pace. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join us next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.